Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth session in our series on MC squared, Managing Care, Managing Costs. Today's episode is Monitoring, Auditing, and Following Up. In our previous three episodes, we talked about lowering costs, how to manage, identify costs, lower what I'm spending, keep track of that, and some ways to do that. Our second episode was on optimizing performance, how to ensure, to the best of our ability, that our cost reductions aren't translating into reduced care, or at least care below an acceptable level. How can we identify those goals and manage them? Third session was on how can you affect in your organization the changes that you'll have to make, either organizationally or in terms of skill set or in terms of job responsibilities, basically a reshuffling of your organization to accomplish these new ideas that you may not have been practicing in the past. For example, how can I get a case manager more involved in understanding and managing the costs related to the care that they're providing. Today, we're going to talk about monitoring, auditing, and following up. So this is the how do I ensure, in effect, that everything I've talked about to now is actually happening successfully. And perhaps one of the best ways to think about this is those of us of a certain age will remember the great communicator, President Ronald Reagan, when he told Mikhail Gorbachev at a summit, trust but verify. Our principle at the time in foreign policy was, we'll trust you, but we're going to watch out and make sure we see what you're doing. So, in my opinion, auditing, monitoring, following up is this exact thing. So what is trust? If you think about if you had young children at home, how do you develop a trust that your kids are going to do the right thing? Well, you start by setting boundaries, telling them no television before you do your homework, or look both ways before you cross the street, or be home when the street lights come on, or whatever the boundaries are. And then you'd educate them on why those are in place and what they need to do, and you'd basically trust that they're going to do that. Not very many parents would then stop at that point. They would verify and follow up and check and audit that their kids are doing what they told them to do. That's the verify part of it. So in the concept that we've been talking about in MC squared, we're going to have, for example, a case manager who now has to pay attention to costs and or prepare budgets, may not be very good at that. First of all, we'd have to educate them on what it is they need to do, explain the boundaries, why we have to do this and what we're trying to accomplish, and then have tools in place to follow up and make sure they're doing it right, make sure they're doing it well, make sure that they're doing it on a timely basis. So that's the monitoring, auditing, and following up. Trust, but verify. Ways that we can verify what happens is technology. For example, a printed budget report, actual versus budget, printed off your general ledger system. There's perhaps an example of technology that does that. We want to prevent bad things, stop people from doing what they should not be doing. So if I don't want someone to buy something without prior approval, how do I stop that? What would be the method for preventing someone from going out and buying on their credit card something that perhaps we don't need and is going to inflate costs? And I want to monitor what's happening. That could be monitoring outcomes for the people we serve. It could be monitoring budgets. It could be monitoring the time, the direct time that clinical or care workers are spending with the people that we serve. So those are the sorts of things we want to be doing to ensure that all of our new initiatives are working and working well. And one of the keys is that those initiatives are new and perhaps need more monitoring and following up than the ones we've been doing for these 20 or 30 years. So the slide that we have here, our outline of MC squared, we think covers these issues. Trust says you should define boundaries. That's what that top line is, define acceptable outcomes. We need to, as an agency and as a industry, define what it is that is acceptable in the level of care that we're providing to the people that we serve. We do not want to lower the costs to the point that we can't provide effective care. Our first principle, identify manage costs, lowering costs, is quite simple. Just stop providing care. Your costs will go way down, but that's not acceptable. So we're setting boundaries. Now these boundaries are in process. OPWDD is doing that. Individual agencies perhaps are defining what it is we want to provide, but it's setting the boundaries. The other thing is, in trust, is to educate the people. Well, that's where we're talking about identifying the costs that we need to better monitor, how to do budgeting in a better way, what POMs, what personal outcome metrics we are looking to track, what organizational changes, what your new job role will be in order to support this. Those are all educational ways to do this. And then the verify part is the last step. How do we ensure that you're actually doing that? Okay? We can call these things a whole bunch of things. And in your agency, you might call what we're talking about monitoring. You might call it feedback. You might have an internal audit function. You might call it verifying that I've filled out the form correctly. Some of you will have compliance officers that are ensuring that I am properly adhering to, say, HIPAA or some other regulatory requirements. You might call them checks and balances. You might call them internal controls. They're all, in my opinion, and for the purposes of our MC squared discussion, all synonymous. Whatever you want to call that follow-up feedback loop that says, am I doing it right? If so, great. If I'm not, what do I need to do to fix it? And am I reaching the goals that I want to accomplish? Okay? So I'm using the generic term here, internal controls, and I have a slide, definition of internal control. You can read it if you want. The slide's going to appear here a few times. This comes from, I believe, COSO, C-O-S-O, and I should have looked up what it stands for because I don't remember, but it's an organization that has defined from a financial auditing standpoint what internal controls are that you as an organization should be considering. And this is what they defined it as. It's a couple of paragraphs. But one of the keys is it's put in place by an entity, in your case an agency's board of directors and management. Okay? So this comes from the top. Internal controls start at the top. They have to be defined by the leadership to say, these are the controls we have. And the point of these controls is to ensure that we are achieving our objectives. So in this case, our objectives would be to lower costs, to ensure that outcomes don't suffer, and to ensure that the changes we've made in our organizational structure to support that are effective and working. Effectiveness and efficiency. That's the point of this, is to see that we're, in Ralph's slide from 2 episodes ago, he had a triangular slide with arrows going up, and there were arrows on the outside of the triangle, which were activities not pointing towards our goals. So those would be ineffective or inefficient activities. So our controls are to ensure that we're getting the arrows inside the triangle. Okay? We're looking for reliability of financial reporting. Now, this comes from COSO, which is talking about financial reporting. In our case, we want to talk about reliability of any sort of reporting, any kind of feedback, any kind of outcome metrics that we're tracking would fall under that definition. And compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So your goals, your compliance department's responsibility for HIPAA compliance, for example, is one example of this set of internal controls. Okay? So many of your agencies may have thought of compliance as strictly regulatory compliance. I'm suggesting we expand that concept, not just to are we following the laws, but those laws can include corporate objectives and directives to manage costs, increase outcomes, change our organization to support it. And the last one, this second bullet point here, is real important in my opinion. Internal control is not merely documented by policy manuals and procedures. So your compliance officer says, yep, we got it all written down, it's on the shelf over there. What it is a bunch of people constantly looking out to see, are we doing it the right way? Ralph would call that continuous improvement. It could be monitoring and feedback. We want to know, is this working? Perhaps under the old methodology of provide care and get reimbursed, things could slip through the cracks. Perhaps we could go over budget. Things could happen and we could get reimbursed, and we weren't as concerned with running a tight ship and ensuring that we weren't wasting money. Well, the state and Medicaid are now saying the goal is to ensure you're not wasting money. So we need to look at every penny and see what's happening. So we need to have a culture, start to have a culture where people are looking to say, oh, here's a place where I think we can save something. That's this constant monitoring and following up. Okay, we're going to have two polls back to back. And the reason is that this webinar software only allows us to ask you 5 choices at a time. And I got more than 5 choices. So we're going to have 2 polls. So the first one is the polls open on your desktop, and if you check all that apply, you can click multiple items. Does your agency have detailed job descriptions? Do you have computer passwords? Do you have annual employee reviews? Do you do budgets of some form or fashion that we talked about on the first episode? Do you have an internal audit department? If you check all that apply, and we will give you a couple more seconds to check that, and now we'll take a look and see what you've answered. I can't see them. Slight technical glitch in the studio here. There we go. Now I can see them. 100% of you report that you have detailed job descriptions. 100% of you report that you have computer passwords. 2/3 say we do annual employee reviews. 100% have budgets, and 40% of you have an internal audit department. Okay? Next poll is just more of the same. We're going to run this. Oh, I got to click the slide so I can see what the poll says. Okay? So another poll is now open. More questions. Check all that apply. Do you do employee surveys, the nature where you're asking your employees about their job and their involvement in their job? Personal outcome measures, are you monitoring and tracking these in your agency? Do you have customer or client satisfaction surveys? Do you have a process for purchasing and approving in advance expenditures? And do you have financial or operating reports for programs and consumers? This would be giving a program director, this is what you spent this month, or a report that this consumer is doing this well with their outcome measures. Okay? So let's take a look and see what the answers are in this poll. Okay? Nobody scored, oh, you do have 100 there. So about 77% say I do employee surveys. 40-some percent have personal outcome measures in place. 77% say we do surveys of our clients or customers. 100% have a purchasing approval process. And 92% have financial reporting. Okay, so what do all these things have in common? They're all internal controls. You may not think of them in that way, but that's what they are. They're all methods of monitoring what's going on, determining if it's going the way you want it to go, and providing feedback and change when it's not going properly. Okay? So what do we have in place? We have reasons for controls. We want to ensure consistency. If everybody's doing the same thing and they're all doing it the same way, we're going to be a lot better at it, more efficient, and be able to do it at a lower cost than if everybody's making it up as they go along. Okay? So having a purchasing process in place is a way of consistently spending our money on what we need it for. Having employee annual reviews is a way of ensuring that people are doing what their job description says. Interestingly, I think if I recall, 100% of you said you have job descriptions, but not 100% of you are doing annual reviews. So where's the feedback to the employee that says you're effectively doing what your job description says? And especially in a change environment, an organizational change, where I'm asking people to do new and different things that in the past they have not had to do, and perhaps even in good faith they're going to try and do it well, but they're just not quite getting it. How are they going to get that feedback? How are they going to get that fixed so their performance can be consistent with those others in our agency doing the same sorts of things? Another reason for it is error checking. Especially in a case where we're doing new things. If we're now preparing zero-based budgets by person that we serve, and we've never done that before, there might be calculation errors. We might start using a spreadsheet that we didn't use before because we just invented it, and there's a formula error. So we need to go and check these things until we're sure that they're working and working well, so that the feedback and the reporting that comes out of it is reliable. One thing that will kill change in an organization very quickly is if the people in the organization perceive that this change is failing. Okay? So if there's a mistake in what we're doing or in the calculations or the reports that we're gathering, and people see that, they'll say, well, I'm not looking at that anymore. Change management. Some people are just plain resistant to change. I think in a survey that Ralph asked on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, was for what reason might you be resistant to change? And a number of people replied that we are emotionally attached to the old way we do things. Okay, that's classic change management obstacle. I've done it this way for 44 years. There's no reason for me to stop doing it this way now. So a control, an example will be have an annual review where you can say to the person, look, I recognize this is hard for you, but you have to do this. This is important for the success of our mission and our agency, because we're not going to be financially viable if we cannot meet the cost reduction requirements that are being put to us. More reasons for having controls. I can stop you from doing it the old way. Okay? 100% of you replied, we have a process in place for purchasing and approving expenditures in advance. All of you said you have that in place. How many of you will either penalize, discipline an employee who goes ahead and puts it on their corporate credit card after the fact. Okay? A lot of agencies, I know from my own experience, have purchasing in place and also have 3 ways around it. And if you were to count how many times we purchase by the official way and how many times we count by the ways around it, you might be surprised to find that out. So what are you doing? What control is there in place to say, stop, you can't do this anymore? Now, if you have a purchasing process that says, here's how you get a purchase order, and you have a purchasing process that says, here's how you get a check request approved because you bought it yourself, you can clearly identify the errors, the mistakes, the rogue activity. What are you doing to stop it? That's another control. Okay? Reinforcement. Let people know they're making a difference. One of the nice things about being in the industry that you're in is you have a lot of mission-driven personalities in your organization. People who work for you because they want to make a difference. So I think a lot of people will make a good faith effort to do what you ask them to do. If you don't tell them, they're not going to know. So if you tell them, explain the realities of managed care, explain the need for cost control, explain that the optimization of performance does not mean firing half the people. It means identifying things that we're doing that aren't making a difference. You're here to make a difference. You want to make a difference. Why would you want to do things that don't make a difference? Let's stop doing all the things that don't make a difference so you can do more of the things that do. That's optimizing performance and change management. And when they're doing it, they get rewarded for it. They get recognized for it, and they feel good, and they're likely to do more of it. If you don't have a process in place, a control to ensure that, you're not going to be as successful in getting that change to take place. Compliance is another reason for control. Making sure that we've done everything that HIPAA requires us to do, or FERPA requires us to do, or PCI requires us to do, or OMIG requires us to do, or all the different rules and regulations that we have are all reasons to have controls. And in fact, many of the controls that you have in place today may be driven by those outside regulatory forces, and perhaps less so by your own internal goals and needs. A little bit about compliance. I would venture to say that many of you, if you're considering what I've been talking about today, would call that compliance. If you had a person in your agency who would do these sorts of things, they would more likely than not perhaps be the compliance officer. The thing that I don't like about the word compliance is it is a very legalistic term. You must do this, and I will make sure that you did this. There's not a lot of reinforcement there. There's not a lot of change management there. It's thou shalt and thou shalt not. It's kind of a synonym for what I'm talking about, but I want you to consider it more broadly. So I think the concept here is not just regulatory compliance, but anything that I want done consistently, effectively, and efficiently to reach my overall goal is something that should be monitored and managed and audited and complied with. So maybe that is your compliance department. Maybe your compliance department, as part of your organizational change, needs to be expanded to do more of these sorts of things. So what you may respond to me then is, well, I only have one part-time compliance officer, and she can't even get to all the stuff she has to do now, let alone all this other stuff you talked about. I mean, why would I give the compliance officer responsibility for annual employee surveys or reviews? Okay, well, perhaps, but an effective efficient way of doing compliance is not to sit down with the HIPAA rules and regulations and say, okay, I'm now going to comply with HIPAA. On Mondays I do HIPAA, and on Tuesdays I do OMIG, and on Wednesdays I do PCI. That is not necessarily very effective. I think what you'll find that if you put a control in place that serves multiple purposes, that it's a lot easier to control. An example would be you can create a computer password. And that computer password would prevent somebody from doing what they're not supposed to do, i.e. they can't get into payroll, or they can't look at the general ledger, or they can't change the budget. So it prevents somebody from doing a bad thing, but the password can also be used to know when something was done, who did it. It's like a signature. So if you have an incident report, for example, that has to be complied with and someone signs it, there are ways for that password to serve that purpose. So instead of pawing through stacks and stacks and stacks of incident reports to see that they're all signed off on, if that was electronic and you had a password signature method, you could get electronic reporting to say, here are all the incident reports not properly approved. So there are ways to put in place a control to serve multiple purposes. Okay? So that's my outline of monitoring, auditing, and following up. What I just want to take the last minute and go through, because I don't know that we've actually talked about this, is the origin of our logo that we're using to brand this concept. And we hope that when you see this logo, it will remind you of what it is we're talking about. MC squared, as you know, is two MCs, the managed care MC and the managed cost MC. That's the MC squared. The four colored boxes from left to right are our four concepts that have made up our sessions in the last 2 weeks. So the gray one on the left is identify and manage costs. The light blue one is optimize performance. The darker blue one is organizational change. And the light lavenderish looking one on the right is auditing, monitoring, and following up. So those are the things you should think about when you're thinking about managed care. And all of it, of course, is subject to defining an acceptable outcome. That's necessary part of the feedback loop and the monitoring loop, but it's also necessary to ensure that the quality of care that we've been dedicated to for our entire existence isn't suffering simply because costs have to be managed. So that hopefully ensures that you're not thinking of this as get rid of half the people, because that will potentially affect acceptable outcomes. It's get rid of the things that don't matter and don't need to be done. Okay? We're going to run we have been putting a survey up at the end of our webinar. So we'll put up a survey again and ask you to respond, if you please would, provide the feedback to us for this and the other sessions. We're also hoping that in the spring, early spring, maybe February-ish, that we would do another series of webinars. And in this case, something in more detail. Some of the feedback in this last 2 weeks was that this was a very basic overview. And that's in fact what it is intended to be, is an overview of how to think about managed care and managed costs. We recognize that we've touched upon a lot of topics that could be delved into in a lot more detail. For example, how to prepare a zero-based budget. So in the next couple of days, you'll get an email from us, everyone who registered for the webinar, asking for your feedback. Would you like to see another webinar series in more detail? And on what topics would you like to see them? And we'd be happy to prepare that and run that probably, as I said, in late January, mid-February, something like that. So look for that tomorrow, Monday-ish, an email coming from us, and please respond. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for your time and attention, and thanks for attending all 4 sessions.